Hello fellow warriors and welcome to 8.2. If you haven't heard, ARMS got a few buffs to all sorts of different skills and talents. Is ARMS good or is it bad? Well, obviously I'm not going to tell you now, but you will get to see my first impression of the new ARMS with all the buffs and all the changes in some dungeons and raids. I've played ARMS on and off again almost every patch in the last 3 expansions, heroic level rating I would say. Although I am not the top warrior or close to it anyhow, I do have a frame of reference built by playing all the specs in BFA so far, so I can at least compare ARMS to the other specs and mostly to what it was in 8.1.5. In 8.2 ARMS received a couple of buffs here and there, so let's go over them one by one. Execute has had its baseline damage buffed to take 92.2% of attack power from 87% previously. The damage is welcome and helps with execute phases, especially since the default ARMS build focuses on executes hitting often and hard. The second buff ARMS got is to Mastery. Deep Wounds damage is increased by 90% up from 80%. This buff is putting people on the fence. The vocal warrior community, majority of them anyway, don't care too much for deep wounds or the fact that it's our main damage source. It was so far, and it will continuously be since most of the buffs are either to it or to skills that proc and have it scaled off of them. Personally, I don't like the current and past iterations of deep wounds. If a bleed is going to be our main source of damage, think of Feral Druid, then give us more options to snapshot it or control it. Deep Wounds currently is a passive that you cannot manage, happens regardless of your intention, and scores the biggest numbers. Most likely this will not change unless Blizzard decides to rework the spec, or at least the way the mastery works, and my personal opinion, and you can disagree, is that Blizzard is keeping it this way to save them the hassle of actually designing and balancing it. And considering that balancing might be simpler with this type of mechanic, you would think ARMS would be in a better place than it has been so far. Onwards! Mortal Strike has had its scaling buffed to 126% of attack power up from 119%, and Slam as well to 63.6% of attack power up from the previous 60%. Lastly, Rend has had its instant damage buffed as well as its bleed to a point where it can be a competitive talent choice. Focus on the word can. In terms of builds, you can play the same one as before and gradually sim and adjust yourself to stat scaling and essences, or, research what's what. The general build has remained the same when it comes to the talents. You do have a buff to Rend, however, my sims show me it's a 1% DPS loss. Now 1% doesn't mean much, or it can actually mean something very specific. Depending on how ARMS stats scale, it might overtake Massacre. And this also comes into play depending on the encounters in the raid. So far, in Battle for the Zaralor, execute phases were more predominant and more abused to properly clear the encounter. Bosses like Rastakhan, Jaina, Blockade, to name a few, are bosses where the last phase close to the execute phase is crucial to be sped up. And some guilds, ours as well, saved up the major cooldowns for execute phases. Definitely not Bloodlust for Jaina. Come on. What this means is that a talent like Massacre becomes even better if those phases start when the bosses have between 35 to 20% HP, without forcing you off of them on higher HP targets, meaning you'll have a high uptime on Execute. If the same can be applied to Rise of Azshara, then it's possible Rend won't see much play unless it scales weirdly good with higher eye level and essences, which we haven't had the chance to properly test yet. The opposite is true, of course. If execute phases are unreliable, boss phases and guild strategies force you off of a low HP target, Rend might come in handy. I mostly refer to raids because the mythic scene won't change too much. I hardly see how the new affix cannot be exploited more by stronger execute phases since you want the emissaries down as quickly as possible. Mechagon is still fair game, but even so, Fervor of Battle scales and sims the best at the moment, and of course works better in AoE situations. With this being said, I hardly see Rend coming up to make any sort of noise anytime soon. The only difference in builds would be this row at the moment. You'd go with Massacre for heavy single target dealing damage, possibly swapping it out for Rend if you know you cannot keep 100% uptime on Execute. For anything AoE orientated, Fervor of Battle will start to scale up exponentially. Very good with Reaping still, and essentially good if your tank can do very large pulls. And on the topic, let's talk about essences. Considering this is a very early situation and I couldn't get them all on every spec I play, this part I'll base off of the research and theory crafting done by the Skyhold Discord community, so shout out to you boys for your testing and dedication. Resonating Elemental Heart seems the best for single target and seemingly could be the best in slot single target essence at rank 3 since you get the haste buff. Might not be as good before rank 3, so keep it in mind. Theoretically can work very well with Rend as well, so maybe a reason to pick up the talent. Memory of Lucid Dreams is also a good all-around option, seemingly for most resource-starved specs, and we will get to this really soon. Particularly, this will have a good synergy with the Test of Might Azerite trait that still seems to be the best in slot for arms warriors. Being able to sync the essence with Colossus Mash windows will create massive strength boosts from the trait, meaning you will have a massive burst window separated into a dump rage phase, same as now to be honest, and a spend rage phase, most likely still on Blade Storms, which don't actually cost rage. There are more details to go over, and since this is not a guide yet, I recommend checking the Skyhold Discord community where the warriors have already compiled a lot of info for you. Or, you know, make sure your notifications are turned on because we will have a basic arms guide coming up with new essences and Season 3 in mind. Let's talk about performance. And yes, take this with a grain of salt. I do have decent gear on my warrior, however the type of content I'm able to do now, with everyone farming Nazjatar and Mechagon, is a bit limited. Although I did get my hands on a good raid group and a few reaping keys just to get a better idea on how arms handles different encounters. No essences so far, definitely not the good ones also, so I'm waiting anxiously to get my hands on Memory of Lucid Dreams at the very least soon. With that being said, let's go over the raiding bit first. Since I mainly played Prot, I stacked haste a lot, which coincidentally works very well for arms. However, there are still ups and downs, and to be honest, more downs than ups. You still have windows of downtime where you're rage starved, and that can be fixed with higher eye levels of haste, which are indeed attainable, but other haste focused specs do a lot better with the same eye level, so I still have some of my doubts. Since I didn't get my hands on the essences, I can only say that realistically the downtime could be solved if the resource refund proc from Memory of Lucid Dreams could happen at the time when you need it, or if it rounds out throughout the encounter in a way where you are never rage starved. Again, all of this will differ once we go over 430 eye level, for instance, with rank 3 essences. But if this can be solved, arms would essentially feel a lot better. Feeling is one thing, but what about the damage? Well, single target arms is not very impressive. It falls behind most other classes, but that is influenced by mechanics and RNG. And by RNG I mostly mean rage procs. This is why I believe crit is a good stat for arms. Crit hits generate more rage, and again we come back to the resource issue. Overall, the damage buffs arms had were welcome, but not enough to be a top contender, clearly not enough to contend with Fury. The short burst windows are crazy though, and if you can time them well with the content, you'll actually matter on the meters. But in terms of rating, arms needs more love is all I'm saying. Now dungeons. Oh boy. I did a few low keys and higher keys, and I definitely felt better in higher keys. The longer the mobs stay alive, the more your damage will scale, and by damage I just mean massive bleeds from deep wounds. In an ideal world, you would blade storm each pack, and with the resource essences and anger management, that can become a reality later in the patch. Now, I'm a pretty average arms warrior, and by average I can clear heroic raids and do my weekly 10s or higher, but nothing too crazy. The reason this argument matters is that I did a run with a Havoc Demon Hunter and I was surprised I could compete with him on the damage meters. Not always, but more than what most specs can do. The Demon Hunter was a decently scored guy on Radar.io that completed multiple +10s. This isn't to blow my own horn because there's nothing really impressive about either of our skills. What's impressive, however, is the fact that on equally skilled players, ARMS has potential to rival one of the strongest and easiest specs to play in the game. Again, more than we can say about most specs. So in terms of Mythic plus performance, ARMS has potential. Enough to clear it reliably, but who knows how much other specs will scale later on compared to ARMS. As a quick verdict, ARMS can compete in M+ with some of the best specs, if played and geared correctly, and its performance is definitely in the upper bracket, based on logs and what I experienced. For raids, I would wait and test it a bit more. Test the essences and your build on fights first. You might not top the meters, but you probably won't hold your group back. And if you're a mythic raider, you already know how this goes, so there's no reason to get into that argument. You can catch our stream on twitch.tv/MarcelianOnline, where I test specs, play Mythic Plus with viewers, and even aim to become a master by doing pet battles. Another underdog that shows more promise than ARMS is Frost Decay in 8.2 that had a lot of surprising changes and an interesting performance, and we have a first impression for that as well, right here on our channel. Shout out to our Patreons for their support and love for our content. And if you want to hop on board the Marcelian&Online train, choo-choo, then check the details down below. If you don't like benthic gear with all the stats and effects and farming, then get our Marcelian&Online merch down in our official Teespring below. Yes, that is a perfect segue into our branded merch for t-shirts, tank tops, hoodies and mugs when it comes to your World of Warcraft apparel that you can take out in the world. Thanks for watching the video and have an amazing day.